The 2023 NFL Draft is 1 month away, and there are plenty of very interesting quarterbacks in this year's class. Now, there are essentially 4 really good quarterbacks in the class, followed by some guys that could find a role in the future, but probably not as starters. I think basically there are 12 quarterback names that are important, and here is everything you need to know about them, in what order I would draft them as well. Now, there are 2 quarterbacks in this class that I would consider to be truly elite, and they're QB1 and QB2, Bryce Young and CJ Stroud. Nationally, it sounds like Young is viewed as the better, so we are going to go ahead and start with him. Bryce Young was ranked the top quarterback in the 2020 class and number 2 overall prospect. He played for Mater Dei High School in California for his last 2 high school seasons. He was supposed to go to USC, but then he changed his mind and went to Alabama instead. His senior season, Young won 2 awards, including the 2019 California Gatorade Player of the Year and All-American Bowl Offensive MVP. As a true freshman in Tuscaloosa, he backed up some guy named Mac Jones, but he did still manage to throw for 156 yards and a touchdown in 9 games in 2020. Then in 2021, Young finally got his chance to start, and he crushed it. In his first game against Miami, he set school records for a debut as the starter, throwing for 344 yards and 4 touchdowns, and it only got better from there. By the end of his sophomore season, Young had thrown for over 4,800 yards and 47 touchdowns, breaking school records and winning the Heisman. In the postseason, he led Alabama to a big win over number 1 Georgia in the SEC title game, throwing for 461 yards and 4 touchdowns. And then they lost to Georgia in the national championship game, even though Young threw for 360 yards and a touchdown. As a junior in 2022, Young didn't have quite as good of a season as he did as a sophomore, but he did still throw for over 3,300 yards and 32 touchdowns. He missed 1 game because he hurt his throwing shoulder, but he came back the next week and threw for 455 yards and 2 touchdowns in a crazy game against Tennessee. Alabama didn't make the playoffs in 2022, but Young did win the Sugar Bowl MVP and finished second in school history with 8,300 career passing yards and 80 touchdowns. Now, I like Bryce Young a lot, and I think he's very, very safe, but I do personally prefer CJ Stroud, especially after what he showed against Georgia in the college football playoff. I think the arm talent alone and the size concerns put Stroud over Young, in my opinion. CJ Stroud was the 3rd highest QB in the 2020 recruiting class, but he really made a name for himself in his senior season at Rancho Cucamonga High School in California. He won the Elite 11 Finals MVP in 2019 and committed to Ohio State over Michigan and Georgia after throwing for more than 3,800 yards and 47 touchdowns. As a freshman, Stroud only had 1 rush. It went for a 48-yard touchdown, but in 2021, he started 12 of 13 games and led the nation's number 3 passing offense with 380 yards per game. Stroud was lights out in a top 5 matchup against Michigan, throwing for almost 400 yards and 2 touchdowns, but the Buckeyes did lose to the Wolverines for the first time in 9 years. And then to make up for it, Stroud set school records with almost 600 yards, 573 to be exact, and 6 passing touchdowns in the Rose Bowl against Utah. In his first season as a starter, Stroud put up 4,400 yards and 44 touchdowns and was a Heisman finalist. In 2022, Stroud's season started off strong with an efficient outing in a win over Notre Dame, and although he wasn't as flashy as the year before, he did lead the Buckeyes into a rematch with number 3 Michigan with an undefeated record. He threw for 349 yards and 2 touchdowns in the game, but he had his only 2 interception game of the year in a very, very tough 45-23 loss. Even though they missed the Big Ten championship, Ohio State still made the playoffs, and they faced Georgia, and Stroud was electric. He threw for 348 yards, 4 touchdowns, and led the offense into position to win the game with a field goal, but the kick was missed. Stroud finished his final college season as a Buckeye with more than 3,600 passing yards and 41 touchdowns, and once again was a Heisman finalist. Those are the 2 guys I'd consider tier 1, and there are 2 other that I would consider tier 2. I don't view them as good as Bryce Young or CJ Stroud, and they are both both more raw, but still really good and have the talent to put it together and be really good if developed right. And that is Anthony Richardson and Will Levis. Anthony Richardson went to Eastside High School in Gainesville, Florida, and he was a stud on the field. In 4 years, he threw for 4,600 yards and 37 touchdowns, and also ran for 1,600 yards and 41 touchdowns. He was a 4-star prospect and in the running for Elite 8 in 2019. He got offered by 17 schools, including Florida and Georgia, but he decided to go with the Gators. Now, unfortunately, he had to chill on the bench as a freshman while Kyle Trask was the starter, but then he did get his chance to play and threw an interception and a touchdown pass. He only started one game as a redshirt freshman because Emory Jones got the starting role, but when Richardson did play, he threw for 500 yards and 6 touchdowns and ran for 400 yards and 3 scores. Fast forward to 2022, and Richardson was finally the starter for the Gators. Now, the team wasn't great. They went 6-6, but Richardson was the bright spot. He started in all 12 games, and he threw for 2,549 yards and 17 touchdowns. His passing stats weren't exactly amazing, but he was really good on the ground too, rushing for 654 yards and 9 touchdowns on 103 carries. I do view Anthony Richardson over Will Levis. I think the media is being way too hard on Will Levis. I think he's a solid prospect. I do prefer Richardson, mainly because of the escapability and just the pure mobility, but I don't mind either one. I'm not quite sure why people are so low on Levis compared to Richardson. I think both have their fair share of what the hell are you doing moments on film. Will Levis is from Connecticut, and he first committed to Penn State as a 3-star recruit in 2018, choosing them over some other top schools like Iowa and Florida State. He was a top 50 recruit at QB, and he set records in his senior year of high school with 27 touchdown passes and almost 2,800 passing yards. At Penn State, he sat out of the 2018 season and then played in 7 games as a backup quarterback in 2019. He even started one game against Rutgers and did pretty well, throwing for 81 yards and rushing for 108, including a 41-yard touchdown. In 2020, he played in 8 games, including another start against Iowa, but he didn't do as well and he ended up getting benched. He later transferred to Kentucky, where he started all 13 games and led them to a Citrus Bowl win over, get this, Iowa. He had over 3,200 yards of offense and 9 rushing touchdowns. He was also 4th in the SEC with 33 total touchdowns in his redshirt junior year. Then, as a senior, he was voted 3rd team preseason All-SEC, but he didn't even play as well as expected. He started 11 games in 2022, he passed for 2,400 yards and scored 21 touchdowns, but then he decided to skip the Wildcats bowl game and prepare for the NFL draft, and even skipped the Senior Bowl. The next 2 guys are essentially tier 3 guys who I could see sneak up some boards, and I'm going to start with Hayden Hooker, who is a bit of a touchy subject and who is in a very odd situation. Hayden Hooker was a 4-star recruit, top 25 quarterback prospect in the 2017 class out of Greensboro, North Carolina. In high school, Hooker won states twice. He racked up over 9,000 total yards and 100 touchdowns in just 3 seasons. He was named Prep's North Carolina Player of the Year in 2016, and Hooker committed to Virginia Tech over NC State, Notre Dame, and Pitt. In Blacksburg, he had to sit out his first season, but then the next year he rushed 4 times for 57 yards and even scored a touchdown. In 2019, Ryan Willis started the first 4 games and threw 7 interceptions before Hooker finally got his chance to start against Miami, and he broke out. He scored 4 touchdowns in a win, and the Hokies averaged 36 points in Hooker's 8 starts in 2019. For whatever reason, Braxton Burmeister started first in 2020, which was actually my first year at Virginia Tech as a student, but then Hayden Hooker still started 7 games. He finished his Hokie career with almost 4,000 total yards and 37 touchdowns in 15 starts. After that, Hooker transferred to Tennessee and played in every game of the 2021 season after backing up Joe Milton in week 1. He finished the year with over 3,500 total yards and 32 touchdowns, and the Vols went 7-6. In 2022, the Vols started out hot, winning their first 5 games before facing an undefeated Alabama. Hooker was a beast in that game. He threw for 385 yards and 5 touchdowns, and Tennessee beat the Crimson Tide for the first time since 2006. Hooker did later struggle against number 1 Georgia, but they were still in the running for the playoffs heading into a November matchup with South Carolina, and Hooker ended up tearing his ACL, ending his college career. Still, he was the second Tennessee player to ever throw for 6,000 yards and rush for 1,000 more in his career. He was the 2022 SEC Player of the Year, and he even got 17 first-place votes as a finalist for the Heisman Trophy. And if he didn't get hurt, he probably would have won it. Hooker is in a tough spot at 25 years old and coming off of an ACL injury. I did root hard for Hendon, and I always will after his time at Virginia Tech, but I don't love him as a prospect. He isn't nearly good enough with pressure, and he was put in a really, really good spot at Tennessee to succeed. There is an avenue for a reasonably long NFL career, but he's a backup at best. Now, the other guy I would say is in that same tier as Hendon Hooker is Tanner McKee. And I'd even argue he's actually a better prospect. He was a 4-star quarterback and one of the top recruits in the 2018 class. He went to Centennial High School in Corona, California, and he put up monster numbers. 7,600 yards and 94 touchdowns in 3 years of varsity action. Before college, he played in the 2018 All-American Bowl, and he was the MVP of the 2018 Polynesian Bowl. McKee chose Stanford over Alabama, Texas A&M, and BYU, but before he started playing for the Cardinal, he did take a 2-year break from football to go on a mission to Brazil. In 2020, McKee saw some action in one game, completing 3 passes for 72 yards against number 12 Oregon, but it was in 2021 when he began to shine. He made his first start in week 2 against USC, and he led the Cardinal to an upset win, scoring 3 touchdowns and throwing for 234 yards. Later in the season, he led Stanford to another big upset against number 3 Oregon, throwing for 230 yards and 3 touchdowns. He even tied the game with a touchdown pass as time expired and won it in overtime. McKee set a freshman record with 19 total touchdowns, but unfortunately, Stanford didn't have a very good season, finishing 3-9. In 2022, McKee led Stanford to a 16-14 win over Notre Dame on the road. He had some good games, specifically against Arizona State. He threw for 300 yards twice against them, but he never hit the 300-yard mark again against any other team. In total, McKee threw for over 5,200 yards and 28 touchdowns in his 2 years as the starter. Those are the guys that I do think are in those top 3 tiers of quarterbacks, and there's one guy that I really did struggle putting in that 3rd tier, that 4th tier, so we're going to put him right here in the middle at tier 3.5, and that's Hayden O'Connell. He was a bit of a late bloomer in high school, only starting as a senior and breaking the school record with 2,741 yards and 26 touchdowns. But then he didn't get any D1 offers, so he decided to go play with his brother at D3 powerhouse Wheaton College before he walked on at Purdue. He didn't get any playing time in 2017 or 2018, but his big break came in 2019 against Nebraska when both quarterbacks got hurt ahead of him. Hayden came in and he led the offense to a game-winning touchdown with only a minute left. Then the next week, he led the offense to field goal range for the game-winning kick at Northwestern. Hayden finished the year with 1,110 yards and 8 touchdowns. In 2020, he started 3 games before getting injured and missing the rest of the season. But in 2021, O'Connell started 9 games and was even named second team All-Big Ten. Purdue went 6-3 in his starts, including a 48-45 win over Tennessee in the Music City Bowl, a game where O'Connell balled out, throwing for 500 yards, becoming only the 2nd player in school history to do that in multiple games in a season. He finished the year with 3,728 yards and 28 touchdowns. In his 6th season in college, Hayden put up pretty similar numbers, nearly 3,500 yards and 22 touchdowns through the air, as Purdue went 8-4 in the regular season. The Boilermakers faced Michigan in the Big Ten Championship, and Hayden threw for more than 350 yards, but he had 2 interceptions in a loss. Hayden decided to skip the Citrus Bowl against LSU ahead of the 2023 draft. The next 3 guys are quarterbacks that I think have some good tools, so they're in that tier 4 range, but I really don't expect too much of them, but they are at least a little intriguing. Starting with Jake Hayner. He went to Monte Vista high school outside of San Jose and threw for 8,400 yards and a school record 90 touchdowns. He ended up committing to Washington, which was his dream school and his mom's alma mater. He didn't play much his first year, but he did play in 4 games as a backup in 2018, and then he transferred to Fresno State in 2019, but he couldn't play his first year because of transfer restrictions. Then in 2020, he finally got his chance, and he started in all 6 games in that weird COVID year, throwing for 337 yards per game, which was the best in the Mountain West and 4th best in the country. In 2021, he did even better and joined David and Derek Carr as the only quarterbacks in school history to throw for 4,000 yards. The Bulldogs even went 10-3 that year. He threw for 33 touchdowns, and the biggest was the game winner against number 13 UCLA with only 15 seconds left. His 455 yards against the Bruins are also the most in a game in his college career. Hayner decided to come back for one more season in 2022 and played in 10 games, but did miss 4 due to injury. He played pretty well with nearly 2,900 yards passing and 20 touchdowns. He was even named to the All-Mountain West first team. The Bulldogs ended up winning the Mountain West Championship and the Jimmy Kimmel Bowl, and on the national stage, Hayner was the Senior Bowl MVP. Next up is Jaren Hall, who does actually have some college eligibility left, but he's jumping for the draft. He was a 3-star quarterback from Maple Mountain High School in Utah, and he threw for more than 5,100 yards and 52 touchdowns in 28 varsity starts, and that earned him as a top 30 quarterback listing in the class of 2016. He decided to follow in his father's footsteps and commit to playing football at BYU. But before he did start college, Hall took a 2-year mission trip to California. He took a red shirt in 2018, and in 2019, he played in 7 games, making history as the first black quarterback to start for BYU in the program's history and his first college start at USF. He didn't do too bad. He threw for 148 yards and a pick and a loss, but he bounced back the next game, throwing for 242 yards in a win at Utah State. In 2020, Hall ended up taking a medical red shirt due to a hip injury, and in 2021, Hall went 8-2 as a starter. He really shined against Utah, throwing 3 touchdowns and adding 92 yards on the ground in a win on the road. It was the second of 5 wins against Pac-12 competition as a redshirt sophomore. Hall finished the year with 2,500 yards and 20 touchdowns, and the offense averaged 33 points per game. In his last college season, Hall's passing numbers jumped to 3,100 yards and 22 touchdowns. In a game at Boise State, Hall became the first BYU quarterback to throw for more than 350 yards and rush for more than 80 since Taysom Hill did in 2013. Hall sprained his ankle in his last college game against Stanford and ended up missing BYU's bowl game, but he did play well at the Senior Bowl ahead of the draft. Hall finished his college career with an impressive 6,100 yards passing and nearly 800 yards rushing with 61 touchdowns in 31 games. Okay, that leaves the last guy in that tier with Jake Hayner and Jaren Hall as Clayton Tune. He was good in high school at Hebron in Dallas, but only became the main starter when he was a senior. He threw for 2,400 yards and 23 touchdowns that year. He was going to go to Kansas, but he backed out after they got destroyed by TCU, and instead he went to Houston and started playing as a freshman when their starter got hurt. He didn't win too many games as a sophomore, but he did throw for a lot of yards, and then he really started to take off in 2021 with over 2,600 yards and 21 touchdowns. In 2022, he really shined though, throwing for more than 4,000 yards and 40 touchdowns. Overall, he threw for 11,000 yards and 119 total touchdowns in college. That leaves this tier 5, which is 2 guys that are getting talked about, but I cannot see a path to them ever being more than a backup. The talent's not there, and the pro path is non-existent, but they're still getting talked about, and that's Max Duggan and Stetson Bennett. Max Duggan was a 4-star quarterback from Lewis Central High School in Iowa. He was a star in high school and was the top recruit in Iowa, and even won the Iowa Gatorade Football Player of the Year in 2019. He chose TCU over Nebraska and North Carolina, and that ended up being the right choice. In his first year, he set a program record with 2,077 yards and 15 touchdown passes. The Horned Frogs went 5-7, but they did manage to pick up a win at Texas, which was big. In 2020, Duggan had 10 rushing and 10 passing touchdowns in 9 starts. TCU went 6-4, and again, they beat Texas. He even led the team with 526 yards rushing that year. His junior year was a bit rough, and some injuries and a career low in rushing yards were not ideal, but he still kept his passing game strong with around 2,000 yards and 16 touchdowns. And then came 2022, when Duggan made history in Sonny Dykes' first year as a head coach at TCU. He threw for almost 3,700 yards and 41 touchdowns. The Horned Frogs were crushing it with a 12-0 record before losing in the Big 12 championship game, but they still made it to the college football playoff for the first time ever, with Duggan scoring 4 touchdowns in a semifinal win against Michigan. Unfortunately, their national championship game against Georgia was a disaster, and the team lost 65-7, but Duggan was still the 2022 Heisman runner-up and Big 12 Offensive Player of the Year. On the other side of that game was Stetson Bennett, who almost played at Louisiana after his time at community college, but then Georgia came in with a scholarship offer where he originally walked over. He played in 5 games, threw for 1,179 yards, 8 touchdowns, and 6 interceptions. A few months later, he lost the job to JT Daniels. At the start of the 2021 season, he was the backup to Daniels, but he got his chance to start in the second game of the season after Daniels got hurt. He ended up throwing 5 touchdowns in a win over UAB, which did tie the school record for the most in a game, and that was enough to give him the starting job. He ended up throwing for almost 3,000 yards, 29 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions. The Bulldogs went 12-0 in the regular season, but lost to Alabama in the SEC championship. That made a lot of people want to see JT Daniels start, but Georgia stuck with Bennett, and they ended up winning the Orange Bowl against Michigan, and that set up a rematch with Alabama in the national championship game, and Georgia won 33-18. Bennett was great in the game. He threw for 224 yards and 2 touchdowns, and it was Georgia's first national championship since 1980, and Bennett was a big reason for that. There was some talk about him transferring after Georgia went after Caleb Williams, but he decided to stay with the Bulldogs. He had an awesome year, throwing for 4,127 yards, 27 touchdowns, and 7 interceptions. He even rushed for 10 touchdowns. He was a finalist for the Heisman Trophy as well. Georgia ended up going undefeated. They beat LSU in the SEC championship. They beat Ohio State in the Peach Bowl, and of course, they blew out TCU in the national championship. Bennett played great. He threw for 304 yards and 4 touchdowns and rushed for 2 more in the biggest blowout in a bowl game in college football history. Stetson Bennett is definitely a Georgia legend, but that doesn't mean he has a path to being an NFL starter, because there are a lot of guys better than him.